Rain struck the coaching yard in hard, slanting lines, and Karen Johansson nearly lost her footing on the first run of cobbles. The wicker case at her hip knocked against her knee. The leather strap dug into the bruised ring around her right wrist, where fingers had gripped too hard the night before. Water moved through the cracked sole of her left boot at once. It spread cold between her toes, then climbed into her stocking with each step. No one offered a hand. Porters hurried past with trunks for people whose coats still held dry warmth. A woman with a lapdog lifted her skirt to avoid the spray and looked directly at Karen's grey dress, at the patched elbow, at the frayed hem that darkened with mud, then looked away with practised indifference. A gentleman under a broad umbrella watched her cross the yard as if she were a cart horse that had strayed near the posting bench. She kept her chin level and walked on. Her hair had come loose before dawn and now clung in wet strands along her throat, dark as spilled ink against skin gone pale from the cold. She had been called plain often enough that the word had settled in her like grit in a shoe, always there, always rubbing raw. Plain girl, plain face, plain fortune. Yet her eyes missed nothing. She saw the stable boy counting coins twice before handing change to a lady in plum wool. She saw steam lifting from a bowl carried to a clerk in the office and smelled onion broth so sharply her stomach tightened. She saw her own hand tremble when she shifted the wicker case and drew the strap higher to keep it from slipping. Hunger made her fingers clumsy. She had eaten the last crust of bread in the dark, standing by the loft window while rain tapped the glass and wind slid under the frame. The inn door stood open to a yellow wedge of firelight. She stepped onto the threshold and asked for hot tea. Her voice remained formal, low, careful. "Only a small cup, sir. I can pay at noon." The innkeeper did not bother to hide his smile. It was not amusement, it was inventory. Coat too thin, boots gone, hands red at the knuckles, no coin now. He wiped a glass with a cloth that had already been used past cleanliness and said, "Tea is for guests, miss." She stood for a beat, with rain collecting at the end of her sleeve, then inclined her head as though she had asked a favour too large and turned back into the yard. Behind her somebody laughed softly, not cruel enough to be open mockery, not kind enough to be mistaken for anything else. She had slept in an unheated loft above Mrs. Blackwood's milliner shop, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled of old hay and damp rope. The roof had a seam that leaked near the crate where she kept her father's books. She moved the books first when rain came and let water take the blanket instead. Every night she stitched by candle end, mending the same grey walking dress that tore anew at seam or cuff by morning. 3 repairs in 10 days. 1 at the left shoulder where the wicker case rubbed. 1 along the back pleat after she caught it on a nail in the stair. 1 at the pocket where she hid folded pages and nearly had them searched. Thread cost money. Needles cost money. Warmth cost money. Mrs. Blackwood measured all 3 like punishments to be allocated. The ring had been her mother's, a narrow band with a dull stone the colour of smoke. It had never been worth much to anyone but her. She had sold it for postage and sealing wax and 1 clean sheet heavy enough to pass through a solicitor's hand without contempt. The pawnbroker weighed it in silence and pushed 3 coins across the counter, then reached for the ring as if it were already forgotten. She had closed her fingers over the coins and left without speaking, because words would have broken something she still needed. Those coins became stamps, then ink, then the right to send a letter no one had asked her to write. By the time she set out for York, she had 1 coin left and chose to keep it for filing fees instead of bread. Mrs. Blackwood would not pay for a carriage. Mrs. Blackwood said walking built character in girls with weak prospects. The road measured 9 miles in rain and ruts, and a mile of it climbed against wind that shoved her sideways. She arrived late anyway, mud to the hem, hair undone, hands numb. Mrs. Blackwood met her at the back door in violet silk and rose water in a doorway bright with mirrors and ribbons imported for other women's hats. "You shame me," she said, and struck her in the mouth before 2 customers and a seamstress young enough to flinch. Karen tasted iron. She took out her handkerchief, wiped her lip, folded the cloth to hide the stain, and asked what task remained unfinished. Tears burned, then receded. She had learned years ago that crying fed no one and persuaded no one. She had learned to keep her breath level while her skin sang from the blow. She had learned to stand very still until pain became information instead of panic. At night, when the shop went quiet and the house settled into boards and sighs, she lit a stump of candle and copied legal passages from her dead father's law books. Consideration, capacity, duress. She wrote each term in a careful hand until the letters held steady under fatigue. Her father had been a solicitor of modest standing and exact habits, a man who sanded ink before turning a page and corrected punctuation as if justice depended upon commas. Fever took him in 6 days and left his desk locked, then unlocked, then stripped by hands that called themselves practical. He had left a will protecting Karen's dowry until marriage. Mrs. Blackwood had married into the house months before his death. Within a year the silver was gone. The orchard was mortgaged. Suppliers called at the door. The parlour chairs vanished one by one under sheets and then under debt. Callers were told that sacrifices were being made for family survival. Callers were told Karen should be grateful that any titled man would consider an engagement to a girl with no beauty and less sense. By the 2nd week of October, Karen had stopped counting insults and started counting signatures. She found ledgers where they should not have been. She saw figures altered in a cramped hand meant to resemble her father's long, clear script. She watched Mrs. Blackwood receive men in private and send them away with promises she had no legal right to make. She listened from the stair while her own future was discussed as if it were a bolt of cloth to be cut and sold by measure. The Duke of Ravensmere's name entered the house on thick cream paper and left on whispered breath. Engagement, settlement, rescue, respectability. The words moved through rooms where she was expected to pour tea and remain silent. She did neither foolishly nor bravely. She listened. She remembered. She copied what she could when no one watched. The wicker case at her side held legal papers, wrapped against rain in oiled linen. At the centre sat the letter she had written and rewritten until every sentence could stand in a court without apology. She did not travel to plead for affection. She had none to offer and expected none in return. She travelled to file her own release before Ravensmere's household could cast her off through formal channels, while Mrs. Blackwood performed injured innocence for the county. If she relinquished her claim with her own hand, the leverage shifted. If she chose humiliation on paper, she could prevent humiliation as transaction. Mrs. Blackwood wanted either a marriage that unlocked the dowry or a broken engagement rich enough to extort compensation for imagined damage. Karen intended to give her neither. Destitution under her own name was cleaner than comfort bought as collateral. The rain thickened. Wheels hissed through standing water beyond the yard gate. A bell sounded from a church tower across the street, thin through weather and distance. She crossed to the covered walk outside the registrar's office and paused to wring water from the edge of her sleeve. Her fingers were raw at the pads where pen and needle had worn them down. The bruises across her knuckles had turned yellow at the edges. She pressed her hand once against the wicker case, as if to confirm it was still there, still dry, still carrying the only leverage she possessed. Inside, she knew there would be clerks with clean cuffs and polished quills, men who would glance up and judge before speaking. She knew her dress would answer questions before she could. She knew Mrs. Blackwood might arrive before noon with a new demand and a sweeter lie. None of it altered the task. She stepped up to the registrar's door. The brass plate was cold against her wet glove. Her stomach twisted with hunger so sharply she had to draw one slow breath through her nose before she could lift the latch. Then she straightened her shoulders, set the wicker case against her hip, and entered to end her own engagement before anyone else could end it for her. Warmth met her face first, then the smell of wet wool and iron gall ink, and neither was enough to quiet the shaking that had settled beneath her ribs. The registrar's outer room was narrow and overlit by two high windows where rain dragged itself down the panes in grey sheets. A coal fire burned low behind a brass grate, too distant to reach the benches along the wall where petitioners waited with hats in their laps and impatience on their mouths. Karen crossed the flagged floor and left a trail of water that a boy with a rag noticed at once, his glance quick and scolding before he dropped his eyes again. At the high desk, a clerk in a black coat accepted a folded petition from a farmer, blotted it, tied it, and passed it to another hand without looking up. Order lived here in stacked bundles and labelled drawers, in sand shakers and sealing wax arranged by colour, in pens cut to precise nibs. Her father had taught her that kind of order before she was tall enough to see over his desktop. Stand straight, read twice, date everything. Never trust memory where paper can serve. The first time he had let her hold his seal, the brass felt too heavy for her wrist, and she had pressed it at a tilt into cooling wax. He had laughed once, softly, then showed her how to centre the pressure so the crest did not blur. That crest had been simple, a sheaf of barley and a book, no Latin motto, no pretence to old blood. Useful symbols, he had said. Food and law. Keep those honest, and a house may stand through a bad season. He had believed in seasons then, in trough and rise, in effort rewarded over time. Fever had no respect for effort. It took him in September before the harvest came in, while Mrs. Blackwood instructed the cook to air the morning curtains, and told neighbours he had been overworked by clients who never paid. Karen remembered the physician's boots near the bed, the basin that stayed pink too long, the way her father's hand searched the blanket for a pen, even after he could no longer focus on the page before him. "The codicil," he had whispered once, and she had bent close, and he had tried again. "In my red folder." Mrs. Blackwood had answered from the doorway, silk rustling at her knees. "Rest, dear. Business can wait." Business had not waited. The red folder disappeared before dawn. By the time condolences ended, drawers had been emptied, locks changed, and the carriage sold under the language of necessity. Karen set her wicker case on the clerk's ledge and felt that old exact grief move under her skin like winter water. She gave her name. The clerk finally looked at her face, then at the patched cuff resting near his clean ledger, and repeated it in a tone that asked what had become of a house once known for neat accounts and punctual filings. "Johansson," she said again, steady as she could make it. "I have a private declaration to lodge before noon." He nodded toward the bench without warmth. "You will wait your turn, miss." She took the bench nearest the fire that the heat reached her only in brief breaths, and held the wicker case with both hands as if it might be pulled away if she set it down. Waiting gave memory room, and memory arrived with an accountant's cruelty, item by item, charge by charge, never rounding mercy into the column. Mrs. Blackwood had entered their life in lavender gloves and widow's grey, speaking modestly, praising her father's discipline, telling anyone who asked that she valued steadiness over display. Her own husband had died 3 years before, leaving debts wrapped in polite lies, and 2 daughters trained to smile at gentlemen while servants carried their parcels. Karen had been 16 when the wedding breakfast was served in their own drawing-room, beneath the portrait of her mother that Mrs. Blackwood said unsettled guests and had moved upstairs within a week. The daughters took Karen's chamber because it received morning light. Their trunks arrived with silver brushes, scent bottles, and gowns lined in dove satin, while Karen moved to the small room beside the back stair where the latch did not catch in damp weather. No one called it theft. It was called adjustment, then economy, then family compromise. Plates from her mother's dowry vanished from the sideboard and reappeared at a draper's auction. The orchard lease was renewed at terms her father would have rejected on sight. Coin from legal retainers went to hat feathers imported from France because appearances had to be maintained while creditors circled. "A household is a theatre," Mrs. Blackwood liked to say, smiling at her reflection while pins flashed between her lips. "If one keeps the audience persuaded, one survives." Karen learned what survival meant in that theatre. Bread ends after guests were fed. Sleeves turned and turned again until the fabric thinned to gauze. Errands in rain without a cloak because the good mantle belonged to one of the sisters now. Public correction for private obedience. Public silence for private injury. The first time Mrs. Blackwood struck her where others could see, it had been with a fan, a glancing crack against her temple for speaking while spoken over. The sisters had watched from the stair and copied the smile they had learned from their mother, the one that made cruelty look like etiquette. Later they took her mother's music folios from the cabinet and sold them, page by page, to a teacher in town. She found the empty ties and the indentation where the leather spines had rested for years. Later still they wore her mother's blue shawl to a winter assembly and told 3 ladies it had been theirs since childhood. Karen had stood near the punch table and listened while one of them described the weave incorrectly, because she had never cared to notice it when it was in the house. Correcting her would have made a scene. Remaining silent cost less in that room, though the cost was never small. By late spring she had become useful as an object lesson. "Look at Miss Johansson," Mrs. Blackwood told apprentices in the shop, arranging ribbons beneath glass. "See what becomes of girls who confuse reading with prospects." Karen kept reading anyway. At first she copied statutes to keep her hand from shaking. Then she copied account entries because numbers did not flatter and did not forgive. Debts marked paid where no payment had been made. Promissory notes rewritten with altered dates. A supplier's signature traced, not signed. Her father had taught her to compare line weight, to watch the pressure on downstrokes, to read hesitation in ink. She saw hesitation everywhere in the Blackwood books. She began to copy what she found onto loose sheets, folded into the lining of her case. Not for revenge, for proof. There was a difference, and she held to it the way she held to posture when her boots leaked and strangers stared. When the engagement offer came, it arrived as salvation spoken by people who would not bear its terms. The letter carried the Ravensmere crest in clean black wax and language as formal as a court order, proposing an alliance that made no sense to anyone who looked past title and rumour. A duke of vast estate and colder reputation. A girl without portion in hand, with a stepmother eager to narrate her gratitude. Mrs. Blackwood took the letter to every parlour that would receive her, and described the match as a reward for prudent management, for piety, for sacrifice. She never said that Karen had not been asked whether she wished to marry a man she had met once, across a crowded room while his gaze remained on the rain at the windows. She never said the settlement drafts came back and forth in frantic intervals because she pressed for immediate release of dowry assets to prepare suitable trousseau obligations, each phrase polished, each demand barbed. She never said that when Karen asked to review the terms, she laughed and told her girls, loud enough for the seamstresses to hear, "She imagines herself a barrister now. Next she shall request chambers." Karen had not requested chambers. She had requested to read the document that traded her life. The answer was a slap behind a closed door and 2 days without supper for insolence. After that, she read in secret. Mr. Bellamy's name appeared in one margin as counsel to Ravensmere. Another notation, likely in his hand, circled the clause advancing funds to Blackwood accounts prior to solemnisation and marked it with a single word, "Inquire." That word gave Karen her first true breath in months. Somebody on the other side had seen the fracture line. Somebody had not signed blindly because rank had spoken. She began writing her release that night by a candle no thicker than her thumb. "I relinquish all claim. I seek no damages. I attest under my own hand that no promise of settlement was made to me personally." Each sentence stripped her future to bare boards. Each sentence also removed one tool from Mrs. Blackwood's hand. If the engagement ended by mutual withdrawal without compensation, there would be no scandal payment to pocket, no leverage to force a private settlement, no story of a ruined daughter to stir county pity into coin. Karen understood exactly what she was choosing. No dowry, no protection of marriage, no secure room in winter, no certainty that any household would employ a young gentlewoman who had nearly become a duchess and then did not. Hunger she already knew. Public dismissal she already lived. Better the clean wound she chose than the slow suffocation of becoming line item and collateral in ledgers written by other people. On the bench, her wet skirt clung to her knees and chilled her through, and the room seemed to tilt once before settling. She set her jaw, opened the wicker case just enough to touch the oilskin packet, and closed it again. Across the room, 2 men in travelling coats discussed barley prices as if no one else existed. A woman in black gloves dabbed her nose with lace and complained to her companion that legal offices always smelled like damp dogs and ink. Karen kept her eyes on the clerk's pen, moving in deliberate strokes, and counted each stroke as if it were a step on a road she had to finish walking. A second clerk came from the inner door with a ledger under his arm and called 3 names not hers. Time thickened. Rain beat harder against the window, then eased, then returned. The coal fire settled with a low collapse that sent a brief pulse of heat into the room and drew the smell of wet cloth upward. Karen's hands had begun to stiffen, and she flexed her fingers one by one inside threadbare gloves while she reviewed again the map of obligations that had brought her here and still pressed against her ribs like stays pulled too tight. Her mother dead by childbirth fever when Karen was 7, her father remarrying because grief and work did not keep house by themselves, a stepmother who wore concern like jewellery and counted affection as expenditure, 2 stepsisters who borrowed her comb, her ribbons, her place at table, then her name when it suited them to mention kinship to a respectable solicitor. Debts growing not from famine or failed harvest, but from vanity purchases entered as household essentials. Violence administered in measured doses, where it left no obvious mark beneath sleeves. Apologies demanded from the injured party for disturbing peace. Karen had endured each small subtraction because endurance was the only coin left to her, and because somewhere under floorboards and dust her father's intentions still existed in law, if not in comfort. She had copied his original will from the probate register when Mrs. Blackwood said the house copy had been misplaced. She had compared signatures across 10 years and marked where ink colour betrayed new writing on old paper. She had kept copies of altered ledgers wrapped in muslin beneath the loose board near the loft crate, then moved them last night into the wicker case when she chose this day. She had sold the ring, walked the miles, accepted the stare of strangers, and entered this room without sponsor, maid, or carriage. Present pressure, not memory. If she failed to file before Blackwood agents lodged their own petition, she might be painted incompetent, unstable, coerced by unnamed parties. If she filed cleanly, witnessed properly, the narrative narrowed to facts. Facts were the one territory where she had been trained not to yield. The first clerk finally looked up from his books and crooked 2 fingers in her direction. "Miss Johansson, desk 3. She rose too quickly, steadied herself on the bench edge, then crossed the room with the wicker case held close, each step careful on the wet stone. At desk 3, a fresh sheet waited beside a sand tray, and the clerk tapped the space for signature without meeting her eyes. She set the case down. She drew out the folded release with hands that no longer shook. She laid it flat between them, and heard her father's voice as clearly as if he stood at her shoulder. "Read the terms, name the parties, mark the date, then sign only what you can defend before God and law." She reached for the pen, aligned the sheet, and lowered the nib toward the signature line when the outer door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass in both windows. A gust of rain-laden wind tore through the room and scattered loose scraps from the copying tray across the floor. The woman in black gloves gave a sharp cry and stood. One clerk swore under his breath as sand spilled over fresh ink. Boots struck stone in quick succession. A man in a dark travelling coat shouldered through the doorway, hat in hand, rain running from the brim in a steady line. His face was narrow, clean-shaven, and grey with haste. He did not pause to apologise. He scanned the room once and fixed on desk 3. "Miss Johansson," he said, voice clipped by urgency. "Do not sign that." Every head turned. Karen felt the room tighten around her like wire. The clerk beside her drew his hand back from the ledger as if the page itself might now carry danger. The newcomer crossed the floor in 6 long strides and placed a sealed packet on the desk, the wax marked with a raven crest she knew from settlement papers and sleepless nights. "Edmund Bellamy, acting for His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere," he said to the clerk, producing credentials with fingers that shook only once. "I require immediate stay of any filing related to the proposed engagement between His Grace and Miss Karen Johansson pending delivery of direct instruction." The clerk blinked, then looked to the senior registrar through the inner doorway. Confusion broke into whispers along the benches. Karen kept her spine straight and her hand on the pen. She had expected dismissal. She had expected formal language, cold and punctual. She had not expected to hear her own name spoken like a warning. Before the registrar could answer, a crash sounded from outside, wood striking stone, then the high, frantic scream of a horse. Someone shouted in the yard. A second shout followed, closer, then cut off. Bellamy flinched toward the door. Karen did not move, but her pulse leapt hard against her throat. Through the open entry she caught a flash of black harness, a wheel at an angle, a groom dragged half a pace before he found footing. Then a figure filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, rain-dark, and wrong in the way an aristocrat looked wrong when the world refused his control. The Duke of Ravensmere entered without waiting to be announced. Water streamed from his greatcoat. His gloves were dark with rain and something deeper at the right palm, where wet red spread between the seams. A shard of carriage lantern glass clung near his cuff, before dropping to the floor with a thin, bright sound. He removed his hat with his left hand, gave it to no one, and set it on the nearest bench himself. His jaw looked carved from winter stone. His eyes moved once through the room, counted witnesses, found Bellamy, then came to Karen and stopped. She felt that look as a physical force, not admiration, not pity. Assessment exact and unsparing. Her wet hem, her patched sleeve, her knuckles swollen where old bruises had not fully faded, the pen still in her hand. She had seen him only once, at close distance months earlier beneath chandeliers and polite lies. Then he had stood in dry black wool, untouched by weather, a man everyone watched to guess his mood. Now rain marked his hair, and his cravat sat crooked from haste. A line of blood tracked across the back of his hand and down toward his wrist. The room held its breath. He spoke one word, low and absolute. "Sit!" She had not known she was swaying until the command locked her knees. Pride told her to remain standing. Cold argued otherwise. The bench edge struck behind her calves, and she sat before either side one. Bellamy stepped forward. "Your Grace, you should have allowed the surgeon at the inn." Ravensmere did not look away from Karen. "Later." The senior registrar emerged at last from the inner office, ink on his fingers. Annoyance prepared, and then checked when rank became visible. He bowed. "Your Grace, we were not informed." "You are informed now," Ravensmere said. "No document concerning Miss Johansson is to be entered until I have reviewed it." The registrar's eyes flicked to Karen, to the paper beneath her hand, to Bellamy's sealed packet, and back. "This office recognises proper procedure, not mere urgency." "Then observe both," Bellamy replied, opening the packet with measured care. "Written instruction under seal, time marked this morning." By the time the wall clock struck 10, rain had softened to a steady hiss, but the room had grown colder. Wet coats steamed near the weak fire. The groom outside cursed softly while writing harness. Inside, clerks shuffled records into defensive order. Karen could feel tremor in her fingers returning. She set the pen down before it betrayed her. Ravensmere took 3 steps toward desk 3 and stopped at a distance that was formal and still too near. In the brighter light she saw the cut at his palm more clearly. Not deep, but ragged, likely from shattered lamp glass when the horse reared. He seemed not to notice it. Bellamy placed a clean cloth on the desk, within his reach. Ravensmere ignored that as well. His attention remained on her face as if the whole legal office had reduced to 2 names and 1 question. "You sent to dismiss me, Your Grace," she said. Her voice carried farther than she intended. Silence answered first. One clerk bent over his ledger with fierce concentration and wrote nothing. Ravensmere's mouth tightened. "I sent for the truth." The words struck with the force of a doorbolt sliding home. Karen felt heat rise under skin already chilled. Truth. Men with power said that word often when they wanted confession from those who could not refuse. Yet there was no triumph in his expression, only restrained fury aimed somewhere beyond her shoulder. She straightened on the bench. "Truth requires time to read what others hid from me." "Then you have read," he said. "Yes." Bellamy shifted, cautious. "Your Grace, perhaps this should proceed in private." "No," Karen said before she could soften it. "Public arrangements should end in public record." Ravensmere turned his head a fraction, acknowledging Bellamy without yielding. "Close the door." The nearest clerk obeyed at once. The latch clicked. Rain became muffled sound behind glass. No one left. Ravensmere removed his right glove with deliberate slowness. The cut opened again across his palm. A thin line of blood reached his wrist and dropped to the stone. Karen watched the drop fall and hated herself for the instinct that followed, swift and practical, the same instinct that had made her boil bandages for apprentices and mend split knuckles after winter deliveries. He noticed her glance. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition of the impulse. "Do not concern yourself with this," he said. "You are bleeding on legal papers," she replied. A sound moved through the room, almost a laugh from one bench, and immediately swallowed. Bellamy looked at her with brief surprise, then down at the desk to hide it. Ravensmere set the ruined glove aside. "Mr. Bellamy informed me you intended to file a unilateral release. I intended to file it before your office filed yours." His gaze sharpened. "You assume I sought advantage. I assume your household sought distance. I sought evidence." She held his stare. It cost her more than she let show. He was taller than she remembered, broader, built like a man accustomed to cavalry saddles and hard orders obeyed in storms. She knew what he represented. A title older than the town, estates measured in villages, influence that could turn rumour into verdict. She also knew he had arrived himself, in rain, with a bleeding hand, rather than sending instructions and waiting by a fire. That fact disturbed the clean lines of her plan. "Evidence of what?" she asked. "Forgery, coercion, fraud executed through your name and mine." The registrar made a small involuntary sound and then pretended to cough into his sleeve. Bellamy unfolded 2 sheets and placed them beside the blotter. Karen recognised one instantly, an unsigned cancellation drafted in formal legal phrasing, terminating the engagement without financial penalty to either principal. The second she did not know, a memorandum listing irregular transfers from Blackwood accounts and inquiries sent to York banks. Her stomach tightened. He had been investigating, not rumour, entries, dates, transfers. Ravensmere nodded toward her folded document. "Place yours beside mine." For a breath she did nothing. Then she drew her letter from beneath the blotter and laid it flat. The clerk at desk 3 leaned in despite himself. Bellamy read the first lines and looked up quickly, surprise unguarded now. "Miss Johansson relinquishes all claim and refuses compensatory settlement," he said softly, almost to himself. "She drafted this before my arrival." "She drafted it before dawn," Karen said. "Likely before your instructions were sealed." Ravensmere's expression did not change, but the stillness in him deepened. "Why?" It was not quite a question. It was an order forced into one syllable. Karen could have answered in polished language. She could have cited dignity, legal autonomy, unwillingness to be trafficked through scandal. Instead, she gave him the bare truth he had demanded. "Because I would rather be poor by choice than purchased by deceit." Bellamy lowered his eyes. Ravensmere's injured hand flexed once, a sharp movement that reopened the cut at the base of his thumb. He did not react to pain. He looked only at her, and in that long, measured look, she saw the first crack in the cold authority everyone described as absolute, not softness. Something harsher and more vulnerable than softness. Recognition. "You are shaking," he said, "from cold." "And hunger." She said nothing. "Liar," he said, quiet as the fall of ash. "From exhaustion, cold, hunger, and blood loss." The directness cut through the room more cleanly than any raised voice. No one spoke. Karen felt humiliation flare, then fade beneath a harder feeling she could not name. He had noticed, not the dress alone, the body inside it, the cost written across skin and posture. She lifted her chin. "You have your truth, Your Grace. File what you came to file." "Not yet." Bellamy looked from one to the other and intervened with careful respect. "Your Grace, if we are to preserve admissibility, we must establish sequence. Miss Johansson's letter, your cancellation, supporting exhibits, witnesses present." Ravensmere gave a short nod. "Proceed." The registrar cleared his throat. "This office can register both withdrawals and append memoranda of contested conduct. It cannot adjudicate assault or criminal forgery." "It will not need to," Ravensmere said. "The magistrate will." Karen's fingers tightened around the bench edge. Magistrate meant exposure, testimony, cross-questions asked by men who would speak of her as if she were absent. It also meant record, formal and enduring, the one shield stronger than private pity. She breathed once, steadying herself against the wave of dread. Ravensmere saw the movement. "You will not stand alone in that chamber." She met his eyes again. "I stand where I must." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "So I have observed." At the registrar's gesture, the clerk turned Karen's release toward her and set the pen beside the line she had nearly reached before the door had burst open. Karen took it, wrote her name in a hand steadier than she felt, and entered the date beneath, then the hour as requested. The registrar checked the line, marked the margin, and passed Ravensmere's cancellation across. Ravensmere signed with his left hand while his right remained wrapped in stained linen, then returned the pen without comment. Bellamy placed sand over both letters, then lifted each page carefully and held them toward the registrar for notation. 2 documents, 2 withdrawals, no settlement, no compensation, no victory to sell. Ravensmere reached for the cloth at last and wrapped it around his palm with his left hand, clumsy and impatient. The knot slipped. Karen watched it loosen, watched blood mark white linen again, and rose before caution could restrain her. "Hold still," she said. The command left her lips before propriety could stop it. The room froze around the words. Ravensmere looked down at her hand, then at her face. For one charged beat she expected rebuke. Instead he extended the injured hand, silent, and she took the cloth from him. Her fingers moved with the steadiness her body had denied her all morning. She folded the linen once, pressed it to the cut, and lifted his hand toward the firelight to see the edges clearly. The wound was shallow but ragged, bright where glass had torn skin along the palm. Rain and grit had worked into it. She did not look up while she spoke. "Water." "Clean, if this office keeps any." The desk clerk stared, then jolted into motion and fetched a stone jug from the inner room. Bellamy offered his own handkerchief, white and monogrammed. Karen took only the corner, dampened it, and cleaned the Duke's hand with practical care. Ravensmere stood over her without resistance, 6 feet of rank held still by a woman in a patched grey dress and leaking boots. She felt the weight of every eye in the room and ignored it. "This will sting," she said. "Proceed." The clipped answer carried no irritation. It held something harder to pass, an acceptance so complete it unsettled her more than anger would have. She wound the linen tighter and tied a square knot that would not slip. Her bruised wrist complained when she pulled the last turn through. She hid the flinch by smoothing the fold with her thumb. "You must keep pressure for a quarter hour," she said, "and let a surgeon inspect for remaining glass." Ravensmere looked at the knot, then at her face. "You have done this before." "Apprentices split their hands on wire and awls. Needle girls prick deep when they are tired. Men bleed no differently from boys." A low scrape sounded near the door as someone shifted weight. The woman in black gloves had stopped pretending disinterest. The clerks had stopped writing entirely. In that narrow public room, her voice had become instruction, and his silence had become obedience. Social order did not break, but it bent enough for everyone to feel it. By the time the wall clock marked 10:30, the rain had turned fine and persistent. the sort that soaked deeper because it never announced itself. The registrar resumed his seat with the stiff dignity of a man determined that procedure would survive aristocrats, scandal, and female command in equal measure. Bellamy gathered the signed withdrawals and slid them into a leather folio. Karen reached for her wicker case, intending to secure her own copies, when the outer corridor filled with hurried steps and the dry rustle of expensive silk. Mrs. Blackwood entered as if this office were her drawing-room, and all present her invited guests. Violet silk swept the wet threshold without care for mud. Rose water reached the room a beat before her voice. "There you are," she said, fixing Karen with a smile that showed no warmth. "I have searched every sensible place in York to run off and stage drama in a registry office. Childish beyond bearing." Her gaze slid to Ravensmere. She dropped a curtsy calibrated to rank and advantage. "Your Grace, I came as swiftly as roads allowed. This misunderstanding can be corrected in moments." Karen felt her stomach turn, not from fear now, but from the old fatigue of hearing falsehood delivered as refinement. Mrs. Blackwood carried a morocco satchel under one arm, its clasp polished bright. Karen knew that satchel. Bills were paid from it when witnesses stood near. Threats were hidden in it when doors closed. Bellamy stepped forward first. "Mrs. Blackwood, both parties have executed mutual withdrawal. There will be no settlement payment." Mrs. Blackwood's smile did not move. "Mr. Bellamy, you are young enough to confuse signatures with completion. Damage has already occurred. My stepdaughter's reputation has been handled carelessly. My household has incurred expense preparing for a ducal alliance now capriciously discarded. Compensation is the civilized course." Ravensmere's voice cut in, low and flat. "State your demand plainly." She opened the satchel and drew out a folded document tied with green ribbon. "Transfer of Miss Johansson's restricted dowry to Blackwood accounts in trust to offset social and commercial injury sustained. Temporary administration only, pending future arrangement." Karen felt the room narrow around the paper in Mrs. Blackwood's hand. Trust, temporary, future arrangement, the same old cage built from gentler words. The registrar adjusted his spectacles and reached for the document. Karen spoke before it changed hands. "Do not accept that instrument without independent verification of signatures and dates." Mrs. Blackwood turned on her with a soft laugh, sharpened at the edges. "You will be silent!" Karen did not raise her voice. "No!" The single word hung clear as struck glass. Mrs. Blackwood's nostrils flared. "You have embarrassed me before clerks and petitioners. Sign what is required and return home. Your ingratitude has cost us enough." Karen set her wicker case on the desk, opened the clasp, and removed an oilskin packet bound with plain twine. Her fingers shook once. She tightened them until the tremor passed. Then she placed the packet before Bellamy. "Copies of ledgers from Blackwood household accounts," she said, "cross-referenced with probate filings, bank notices, and supplier receipts. Entries altered after posting. Debts duplicated under variant names. Promissory schedules bearing my father's signature, dated 2 years after his burial." The words struck harder than shouting. Even the rain seemed to recede from hearing. Bellamy looked from the packet to her face. "You retained these?" "For months." "Why not deliver them earlier?" She held his gaze. "Because accusation without sequence is noise. I needed dates that could survive scrutiny." Mrs. Blackwood took one step forward, silk whispering over stone. Colour rose in her cheeks. "The girl steals household papers, then performs righteousness. She is unstable. She has always been unstable." Karen's jaw tightened. "I copied them. I did not remove originals until last night, and only those at risk of destruction." Ravensmere had not moved since Mrs. Blackwood entered. He stood beside the desk with his injured hand wrapped, shoulders squared, face unreadable. Yet Karen felt his attention on her with the same relentless precision as before, measuring not tears or theatrics, but sequence, evidence, choice. She could have asked for money now. She could have demanded public apology and private terms. She could have used the dowry as leverage against both houses and called it justice. Instead, she slid the packet fully toward Bellamy. "I make no claim for damages," she said. "Use these to prevent further fraud against your principal and against my father's estate. That is all." Bellamy exhaled as if he had forgotten breath. "Miss Johansson, these documents may establish criminal conduct. You relinquish any advantage they might secure for you personally." "I relinquished that advantage when I signed." Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked. "You ungrateful little burden, after all I have spent to keep your name acceptable, by spending what was never yours," Karen said. The older woman's hand rose, swift with familiar intent, fingers open to strike. This time Karen did not flinch, did not turn her face, did not step back. She simply looked at the lifted hand and then at the witnesses arrayed behind it. Clerks, petitioners, registrar, solicitor, duke, public room, public record. "Touch me here," she said quietly, "and you will add assault witnessed by 12 people to the charges already forming." Mrs. Blackwood's hand halted inches from Karen's cheek. For one suspended beat, no one moved. Then the corridor door flew open again, and a nursemaid hurried in, breathless, cloak askew, a small boy at her side in a navy coat with silver buttons dulled by rain. He could not have been more than 7. Dark hair, pale face, eyes the same storm grey as the man beside Karen. He saw Ravensmere and broke into a run. "Papa!" The nurse reached for him, too late. His shoe skidded on wet stone near the doorway, where a shard of lantern glass had gone unnoticed in the commotion. He stumbled, caught himself with one hand and cried out sharply. Karen moved first. She dropped to her knees on the cold floor and drew the boy gently toward her before anyone else crossed the distance. A bright line opened across his palm, narrow but bleeding freely. The child's breath hitched with shock more than pain. Ravensmere made a sound she had not heard from him before, rough and stripped of command. "Julian!" The boy looked up, trying to be brave and failing. "I am all right," he said, voice shaking. Karen set his hand in her lap. "You are hurt, but you are all right. Look at me." He did. Tears brimmed and did not fall. "That is it," she said. "Breathe with me. In, out, again." Her own scarf was the only clean cloth near enough. She unwound it from her throat and folded it into a pad, pressing gently along the cut to slow the bleeding. The stone floor seeped cold through her skirt. The child leaned against her shoulder without asking permission, small body rigid with effort. "Does it sting?" she asked. He nodded once. "Good. That means your hand remembers itself." The nurse knelt opposite, flustered and pale. "My lord, forgive me, he pulled free when the carriage stopped. I was told to bring him only if needed for the seal identification. And I—" Ravensmere held up his uninjured hand. "Later." He crouched then, a motion that seemed to cost him, not because of the wound in his palm, but because fathers who had buried wives and hardened into command did not always know how to lower themselves to a child's fear in public rooms. He stopped a pace away, as if uncertain where to place his hands. Julian turned his face into Karen's shoulder. "I did not mean to fall." "I know," she said. "Accidents do not ask permission." She tied the scarf with a firm knot, checked capillary refill as her father had taught her with apprentices and stubborn boys, and eased pressure once the bleeding slowed. No deep gap, no tendon exposed. Painful, not grave. You will keep this wrapped until a surgeon cleans it, she said to the nurse. No gripping toys, no climbing rails, no heroic nonsense. For the first time, Julian gave a weak huff that almost resembled a laugh. I do not climb rails. Then today you begin your discipline. She rose carefully, helping the boy stand, and turned him toward his father. Ravensmere did not reach at once. He looked at the knot in the scarf, then at Karen's hands, red at the knuckles and marked with old swelling, then at her face. In his eyes she saw something unfamiliar and unguarded, a raw stillness that made the entire office feel suddenly too small. Julian took the decision from him by stepping forward and pressing against his coat. Ravensmere's uninjured hand came down to the boy's shoulder, firm, protective, lingering there as if relearning the gesture through force of will. The registrar, perhaps grateful for any return to defined tasks, cleared his throat. If the child is present for seal identification, we should proceed while witnesses remain. Bellamy nodded and opened the folio. He withdrew a folded parchment bearing a wax impression damaged at the edge. Master Julian Ravensmere, can you identify whether this is your household signet as kept in the west study? The boy looked to his father. Ravensmere inclined his head once. Julian studied the wax with grave concentration, unusual in so small a face. It is ours, he said, but the wing line is wrong. The lower feather should curve in. Bellamy's expression sharpened. As on attempted transfer instruments received from Blackwood intermediaries. Julian nodded. Our steward says father presses harder on the right side. Karen felt the significance settle through the room with the weight of iron. Forged not only signatures, but seal impressions. Sloppy in detail, confident in intimidation. Mrs. Blackwood drew herself up, eyes bright with fury and calculation. You would involve a child in the legal theatre now. Shameful! Karen turned toward her, voice level. No one involved him. Your papers did. The older woman took a breath to speak again, then checked herself when Ravensmere finally looked at her directly. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You will remain where you stand, he said. It was a command built for battlefields and boardrooms alike. Mrs. Blackwood obeyed it, whether from fear or calculation Karen could not tell. Bellamy gathered Karen's packet, the withdrawal letters, the disputed settlement draft, and the questioned seal memorandum into separate bundles, labelling each in a clear legal hand. He spoke to the registrar with renewed precision. I request immediate certified copies and witness attestations for transfer to the magistrate this afternoon. Include notation of attempted physical intimidation in this office. The registrar glanced at Karen's cheek, at Mrs. Blackwood's still raised posture, at the room full of silent observers who had seen enough. So noted! Karen crouched again to Julian's height and adjusted the scarf where it sat too tight near his wrist. Her fingers gentled at once when they touched him. The boy watched her with solemn trust that landed in her chest like both warmth and ache. Can you wiggle these? She asked, tapping each finger. He did, one by one. Excellent. You have kept your courage. He leaned close and whispered, not quite quiet enough, You tied it better than Cook. A faint sound escaped Ravensmere, almost a breath of incredulous amusement, and gone at once. Karen stood. The room tilted slightly, hunger and strain returning now that urgency had eased. She steadied herself on the desk edge. Ravensmere noticed and shifted half a step nearer without touching her. You require food, he said. She kept her eyes on the documents Bellamy was sealing. I require this entered correctly. It is being entered. Then I require to remain until it is complete. He studied her for a long moment. As you choose. Across the room, Mrs. Blackwood's voice came cold and venom-sweet. Choose carefully, Karen. Once you step beyond my household, no door will take you in. Karen turned her head slowly. She heard her own pulse, heard rain ticking against high panes, heard the scratch of Bellamy's pen as he wrote her name into record beside evidence she had safeguarded at cost to herself. She answered, without heat, "Then I will build my own door." No one laughed, no one looked away. The clerk sanded the final line, shook the excess into a tray, and stamped the margin with the office seal that made private suffering public fact. The seal struck paper with a dull final sound, and Karen felt it in her bones like a verdict. The registrar lifted the page to dry. Bellamy sorted copies with methodical hands. Mrs. Blackwood stood rigid in violet silk, fury held behind her teeth, because witnesses had made open cruelty expensive. Julian leaned against his father's coat, his bandaged hand tucked close to his chest, eyes bright and exhausted. Karen's knees softened without warning. She caught the desk edge. Wood bit into her palm. Ravensmere saw the movement and stepped in before she could pretend it had not happened. "Sit," he said. She remained standing. "I am steady." "No." His voice did not rise. "You are upright. That is not the same." The distinction landed with humiliating accuracy. She hated him for seeing it. She hated herself for wanting, in that single frayed moment, to obey. Bellamy looked up from the bundles. "Miss Johansson, if you fall now, half this office will claim hysteria and the other half will call it guilt. Please sit and let the record remain clean." Practical, not kind. She accepted practical things more easily than kindness. Karen lowered herself to the bench beside desk 3 and kept her back straight so no one could mistake compliance for collapse. By the time the clock hand edged toward 11, the room had settled into an uneasy order. Clerks wrote witness names. The nurse quieted Julian with a low murmur and a peppermint lozenge from her pocket. Rain tapped the high windows in patient, relentless strokes. Ravensmere did not resume his distance. He stood one pace from Karen's shoulder, unmoving, like a sentry at a gate no one else had noticed was under threat. Mrs. Blackwood recovered first. She gave a small laugh, meant for parlours, not legal offices. "Your Grace, this scene has gone far enough. The girl is overtired and suggestible. She misreads account marks because she always fancied herself scholarly. Permit me to take her home. I will see her settled and quieted before further embarrassment occurs." Karen did not look at her. She watched Bellamy tie red ribbon around a packet labelled in his precise hand. Contested instruments. Her pulse steadied by counting the loops. Ravensmere answered without turning. "No." Mrs. Blackwood's smile thinned. "Surely you do not intend to shelter her in your household after this display? Think what county society will infer." "I do not care what county society infers." The words fell cold and clean. A clerk near the fire dropped his pen and bent too quickly to retrieve it. Mrs. Blackwood shifted tactics at once, voice softening into injured authority. "She is my legal responsibility until marriage. You cannot remove her without cause." Bellamy spoke before Karen could. "Cause has been entered into record. Coercion, attempted unlawful transfer, witnessed threat of assault." "That is absurd." The registrar looked over his spectacles. "Madame, this office has documented what occurred in my sight. You may contest interpretation before the magistrate, not here." Mrs. Blackwood's gaze snapped to Karen. "You vindictive child! You would ruin the only household that tolerated you." The old words struck old bruises. Karen felt them, and this time she did not bend around them. "You tolerated my father's income," she said. "You did not tolerate me." Silk rustled as Mrs. Blackwood took a step. Ravensmere moved one half-step forward and blocked the line between them with effortless certainty. No flourish, no threat, just placement, rank translated into geometry. "You will address Miss Johansson through counsel," he said, "if you address her at all." A flush climbed Mrs. Blackwood's throat. "You presume much, Your Grace." "I presume nothing. I observed." He turned then, not to Mrs. Blackwood, but to Karen. His eyes were the colour of river water under storm, hard, deep, unreadable to everyone in the room, but not to her, not any more. She had watched him measure papers and people all morning. She recognised decision when it settled in him. "I have observed since May," he said. Karen's breath caught. Bellamy went very still. Ravensmere continued, voice low enough that others had to lean to hear and high enough that no one could claim he whispered impropriety. "At the first formal call, your left wrist was bruised beneath lace too narrow for the season. You wore gloves indoors, though the room was warm. You did not eat from your own table. Mrs. Blackwood answered for you before you drew breath. Her figures on household rescue shifted by the quarter hour. I instructed inquiries that night." Karen stared at him. She had expected suspicion, perhaps contempt, perhaps strategic caution. She had not expected this severe, exact record of her injuries, kept by a man with no obligation to notice. "You said nothing," she managed. "I had evidence incomplete." "You allowed the engagement to proceed." "I allowed correspondence to proceed while Bellamy traced accounts in York, Leeds and London. I would not accuse without proof. I would not marry into fraud to protect appearances." Mrs. Blackwood made a sharp sound. "Convenient narrative from a man who sought escape from an unwanted match." Ravensmere did not look at her. "Madame, another interruption, and I will request immediate restraint before transfer." The registrar nodded once, already reaching for the bell rope near his desk. Mrs. Blackwood understood the gesture and fell silent, shaking with contained rage. Karen could not seem to feel her hands. Heat rose under her skin, then drained away. He had seen. He had waited not from indifference, but from method. She did not know whether that should comfort or infuriate her. Both feelings arrived and refused to separate. Julian tugged at his father's coat. "Papa, my hand hurts again." Ravensmere crouched at once, a movement less practised and more human than anything she had seen from him. "Show me." The boy held up the wrapped hand. Karen leaned forward on instinct. "It is tight where it swelled," she said. "May I?" Ravensmere looked up at her from his crouch. "Yes." She retied the scarf gently, loosening one turn, checking each small finger as before. Julian watched her face with solemn concentration. "Better?" she asked. He nodded. "You smell like rain and ink." The nurse made an embarrassed sound. Ravensmere's mouth moved a fraction, not a smile, the beginning of one that did not fully arrive. Karen rose from the crouch too fast. The room tilted again. This time a dark edge crowded her sight for a second before it cleared. Ravensmere was on his feet instantly, one hand at her elbow, firm and unhesitating. "Enough," he said. "You will eat." "I can wait." "You have waited all morning." "I have waited years." The answer slipped out raw. She meant to take it back, and could not. Ravensmere's grip did not tighten, but his hand remained where it was, warm through wet wool and the thin sleeve. "Then you will not wait another hour," he said. He signalled to the clerk by the door. "Bring broth. Bread. Now." The clerk glanced at the registrar, received a curt nod and hurried out. Mrs. Blackwood gave a short, incredulous laugh. "How touching! Soup in a registry office. Shall we all applaud this pastoral charity?" Ravensmere turned his head at last and fixed her with a look so flat it erased performance. "You mistake me, madam. This is not charity. This is witness preservation." Bellamy coughed once into his fist, hiding what might have been grim approval. Karen almost objected to the bluntness, then recognised the protection inside it. If she was fed under official eyes, no one could claim she was unfit, unstable, or manipulated by faintness. Even care had legal architecture around him. The food arrived quickly. Thin beef broth in a chipped bowl, coarse bread, a heel of hard cheese. Not elegant. Sufficient. Ravensmere took the tray, set it on the desk, and shifted the inkstand aside himself. "Eat," he said. She lifted the spoon. Her hand trembled once and steadied. Warmth hit her stomach like pain at first, then relief. She ate slowly because hunger made haste dangerous. No one spoke while she finished half the bowl. The room listened to spoon against earthenware and rain on glass. When she set the spoon down, Ravensmere removed his greatcoat and laid it around her shoulders. The wool was heavy with rain at the hem, and warm at the collar from his body. The scent was clean wool, leather, and cold air. She stiffened. "Your Grace, I cannot—" "You can. It is improper. So is striking a woman in public to secure forged transfers. We are past propriety." The words should have shocked her. Instead, they settled in the same place as his hand at her elbow and his relentless accounting of facts. She drew the coat close because she could not stop shivering. Not truly. Bellamy approached with the finished bundles and spoke to Ravensmere, though his eyes flicked to Karen with professional respect that had not been there at dawn. "Certified copies complete. Magistrate's clerk has been notified. We are expected within the hour." "Good," Ravensmere said. He turned back to Karen. The room seemed to contract around the space between them. His voice lowered, meant for her and still audible enough to remain above suspicion. "Do not return to Mrs. Blackwood." She met his gaze. "I have nowhere else at present." "That is not a request." The sentence landed like iron set into stone. Not romantic, not tender, irrevocable. Every person within hearing understood what it meant. He had crossed from observation into action, from inquiry into declared protection, and there would be no polite retreat from it later. Karen's pulse beat hard against her throat. "You cannot order me as if I were in service." "I can order my own household and my own counsel," he said. "I can also state plainly when a place is unsafe. Mrs. Blackwood's house is unsafe. You will not sleep there tonight." Mrs. Blackwood exploded from across the room. "You overreach, sir. She belongs—" Ravensmere did not raise his voice. "She belongs to herself." Silence fell so complete that even the fire sounded loud when a coal shifted. Karen stared at him. She had spent years being spoken of as burden, as duty, as leverage, as future settlement, never as self-possessing, never by a man whose title could have made possession easy. She found her voice with effort. "If I accept temporary shelter, it is under terms." "State them." "Written guardianship protections until the magistrate hearing concludes. My papers remain in my custody. Access to my father's legal books, if they are recovered. No private interviews without a witness until charges are filed." Bellamy's brows lifted despite himself. "Miss Johansson, those are our exacting conditions." "They are legal conditions," she said. "I have learned the cost of vagueness." Ravensmere held her eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. "Granted." "Recorded," she said. Bellamy answered immediately, already reaching for his notebook. "I will draft and have it witnessed before we depart this building." Ravensmere's hand left her elbow only when Bellamy began writing. The place where his fingers had rested felt abruptly cold. Julian, sleepy and pale now, leaned against his nurse and looked up at Karen. "Will you come with us?" She hesitated, not because she did not know the practical answer, because choice, real choice, felt unfamiliar in her own hands. Ravensmere watched her without blinking, as if he would stand there all day and through night if waiting was the price. "I will come to the magistrate," she said. "That was not my question," he replied. She understood then, and the understanding frightened her more than Mrs. Blackwood's rage or the magistrate's chamber. He was asking not for submission, but for decision, and he would bind himself to whatever she spoke next. Karen drew the coat tighter around her shoulders, felt the rough seam of her own mended cuff beneath expensive wool, and answered with the only truth she trusted. "I will not be compelled." Ravensmere inclined his head. "Nor will you be." Bellamy finished the last line, sanded it, and passed the page first to Karen, then to Ravensmere for signature. She signed, with a steady hand. He signed beneath hers, his injured palm leaving a faint rust mark near the margin where blood had seeped through linen. The registrar affixed his seal. Outside, carriage wheels ground through wet gravel. Inside, Ravensmere stood beside her bench and did not move away, as if motion itself had become a decision he refused to make until she rose of her own accord. When she rose, he stepped back at once and gave her the space he had promised in ink as well as voice, but he kept pace beside her as they crossed the threshold into the wet noon and entered the magistrate's carriage under the eyes of half York. The magistrate's chamber smelled of wet wool, coal smoke, and sealing wax warmed too often in one day. Dark panelling absorbed light from 2 narrow windows. A fire burned low behind an iron screen. Bellamy laid every packet on the clerk's long table in a strict line. Karen's signed release, Ravensmere's signed cancellation, the disputed settlement draft from Mrs. Blackwood's satchel, the oilskin bundle of copied ledgers, the memorandum on altered bank transfers, and the questioned wax with the raven wing pressed wrong at the lower feather. Karen set her wicker case beside the table leg and kept one hand on it while names were entered, times marked, and witnesses sworn. By 1 o'clock, the room held the full architecture of consequence. The registrar testified first, precise and faintly offended by disorder even now. He described the attempt to lodge a transfer instrument after both principals had withdrawn. He described Mrs. Blackwood's raised hand. He described Karen's warning given in plain words and in public hearing. The clerk from desk 3 confirmed sequence down to the minute. The nurse confirmed Julian's fall, and the glass still on the floor where the carriage lantern had broken. Julian, pale but steady, identified the flawed seal again, and added that his father never let another man use the West Study signet. Mrs. Blackwood stood in violet silk that had dried into stiff folds and answered every question as if she were granting favour. "My stepdaughter is emotional," she said. "She copies words she does not understand." She called the ledgers household rough books. She called the future-dated signature a clerical misandry. She called the raised hand a maternal gesture misread by strangers eager for spectacle. The magistrate, an older man with a lined forehead and a patience worn thin by practised liars, did not interrupt her performance. He only held out his hand for the next exhibit. Bellamy placed Karen's comparative sheets before him. "Original signature from late Mr. Johansson's probate filing, dated and witnessed. Contested signatures from Blackwood schedules dated 2 years after burial. Ink composition appears newer. Pen pressure inconsistent with known samples. We also filed inquiries to York and Leeds banks 3 weeks ago. Replies arrived this morning and are entered here." He tapped 2 folded letters with red wafer seals. External inquiries, external outcomes, not rumour. The magistrate opened the first reply and read in silence. Opened the second. Read again. His mouth hardened. These institutions deny extending the liabilities represented on your schedules, Mrs. Blackwood, he said. One account number does not exist. The other belongs to a textile concern in Halifax, with no relation to this family. For the first time her face changed. Karen felt Ravensmere's stillness beside her deepen the same stillness she had begun to read as controlled fury. He did not speak. He did not need to. Bellamy submitted the final item, a folded note recovered from Mrs. Blackwood's satchel during inventory, in her own hand, calculating 2 possible outcomes from the engagement: dowry release upon marriage or injury payment upon scandal. Mrs. Blackwood saw that note and went white. That is private planning, not crime. It is motive, Bellamy said. The magistrate rang for constables. The sound was small and final. By 2:30 he gave his ruling in open chamber. Pending trial, Mrs. Blackwood was charged with forgery, coercive fraud, and assault. Her accounts were frozen. Her household books were seized for audit. Her temporary claim over Karen's person and dowry, asserted through step-parent authority, was void under the father's original will and under today's findings of coercion. Interim guardianship was granted through the court to protect Karen's legal autonomy, with explicit terms already drafted and signed in registry: independent custody of her papers, witnessed interviews only, and no forced return to Blackwood premises. Mrs. Blackwood laughed once, brittle as cracked glass. "You cannot confine a lady of rank with debtors." The magistrate looked directly at her. "Rank is not exemption. Take her." She turned then, at last, not to the magistrate but to Karen. Rage shook through her varnished composure. "You have ruined yourself to spite me." Karen held her gaze and answered, with the same measured voice she had used all day. "No, I stopped you." The constables took Mrs. Blackwood by either arm and escorted her out through the side corridor toward debtor confinement. She protested titles and acquaintances. No one moved to intervene. The rustle of violet silk faded down stone stairs and did not return. In the chamber's sudden quiet, the magistrate signed 3 orders and sanded each himself. "Miss Johansson," he said, not unkindly, "your father wrote a careful will. It was nearly smothered under noise. You did well to bring documents, not stories." "I had both," she said. "Only one survives scrutiny." A brief line touched the corner of his mouth. A sound legal instinct. When formalities ended, Bellamy returned the accounted items one by one. The copied ledgers and comparative sheets were retained under seal for prosecution. He gave Karen certified receipts for each retained bundle. Her release and Ravensmere's cancellation remained as filed originals in the registry, with certified copies now in Bellamy's folio, and 1 copy placed in her wicker case. The disputed settlement and forged schedules were transferred to criminal record. Her scarf, blood-marked from Julian's hand, was returned clean-wrapped by the nurse with thanks. Ravensmere's stained linen bandage, replaced by a surgeon in the corridor, was noted and discarded as medical waste with Karen's nod. Nothing vanished. Nothing remained unaccounted. Outside the chamber, rain had thinned to mist. The courthouse anteroom fire burned brighter than the registry's had, throwing copper light over wet stone. Ravensmere stood at the hearth while Bellamy spoke quietly with the clerk about service dates and seizure warrants. Julian had been taken home to rest with the nurse, and his part in the day was done. Karen opened her wicker case and took out the 2 certified copies that had governed the morning, her own release and his cancellation. She crossed to the hearth and held them out. Your question, she said, whether I wished to be free of you entirely. He took neither page. I asked because I would not proceed on coercion, he said, not in any form. She placed both documents on the mantel between them. The firelight made the ink look almost blue. I will not be compelled, she said. His eyes stayed on her face. I know. She drew breath and finished the sentence she had withheld all day. But I will choose. A muscle moved once, at his jaw. Then he picked up both letters, held them over the grate, and fed them to the fire together. Wax darkened, edges curled. Her name and his vanished in the same flame. Then I will ask properly, he said. By the third Thursday after the hearing, formal courtship had reduced itself to small, exact acts, performed under the court's protections, and in plain sight. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper appointed as resident witness, sat in the morning room with mending in her lap whenever he called. Bellamy's drafts arrived with margins wide enough for Karen's own notes. Ravensmere did not touch her without permission. He brought books from his estate inventories and set them on the table for her inspection, like offerings he would not presume to open. On the second visit, he placed a narrow ledger before her. Your father's library list, he said, recovered from Blackwood storage and 2 auction houses. Cross-check it. She did. Spine by spine. Annotation by annotation. 4 volumes still missing. He sent footmen with warrants and receipts. 3 returned within the week. The 4th, a worn copy of Blackstone with her father's marginal hand, arrived from a draper's back shelf wrapped in brown paper and apology. At the 6th week's close, with guardianship protections still active until marriage instrument was read aloud to her satisfaction, they stood in the small chapel off Gray's Inn, where rain tapped leaded glass, and 4 witnesses waited. Bellamy, Mrs. Davies, the magistrate's clerk, and Julian in a navy coat holding still with visible effort. Ravensmere wore dark wool and a plain cravat. Karen wore a cream gown Mrs. Davies insisted upon, and her own mother's ring absent from her hand, because it had paid for postage that changed her life. She felt that absence like a scar and like proof. When the officiant reached consent, he turned first to Ravensmere. Do you take this woman freely, without condition or coercion? I do. Then to Karen. Do you take this man freely, without condition or coercion? She looked at Ravensmere. He didn't speak. He did not command. He waited. I do, she said. After the licence was signed, she placed her name in a hand that had once copied statutes by candle end in an unheated loft. He signed beneath it, his right palm heeled to a thin, pale line. Julian slipped his small hand into hers as they stepped from the chapel into clear afternoon. 2 days later, Ravensmere opened the west wing room at his estate that had been emptied for years and left unused because grief had made him lock doors instead of entering them. Shelves stood dusted and ready. A writing desk faced a long window over winter grass and bare orchard trees. Crates waited on the floor, each marked Johansen Library in Bellamy's careful script. It is restored to your name, Ravensmere said, by deed, not favour. Karen set her wicker case on the desk and unlatched it. She took out the last item she'd carried from the coaching yard, her father's small brass seal, barley and book, the imprint slightly worn at the edges. She pressed it once into warm wax on the new deed while Ravensmere watched in silence. The mark came down centred and clear. She looked up at him, at the man who had once spoken through solicitors and now stood in her father's library with ink on his fingers from helping unpack legal texts. Outside the weather had finally broken. Light moved across the shelves in slow gold bands. Inside, no one called her burden. No one called her collateral. She placed the seal beside the inkwell, straightened the first recovered volume on the nearest shelf, and began her life under her own chosen name.